In the summer of 1789, Paris was running out of patience, and a lot of that anger could be measured in loaves of bread. France was already drowning in debt. The monarchy was unpopular. Taxes were crushing ordinary people. But for a worker trying to feed a family, politics became personal when the price of bread climbed beyond reach. In the years before the revolution, bread could consume most of a working family's budget. A bad harvest did not just mean a disappointing dinner, it meant hunger. When crowds moved through Paris that summer, they were not only searching for weapons, they were also searching for grain. When thousands of women marched to Versailles in October, one of the loudest demands was simple: bread. The monarchy of Louis XVI did not collapse because of wheat alone, but wheat helped turn frustration into fury. A government could survive insults. It could survive pamphlets. It could even survive debt for a while. What it struggled to survive was a city that could no longer afford to eat. That is the strange power of wheat. It looks almost painfully ordinary. A dry stalk, a small hard seed. Grind it into flour and it becomes bread, noodles, pasta, cakes, biscuits, dumplings, couscous, and hundreds of other foods that barely seem related. But for thousands of years, wheat has done much more than fill stomachs. It helped convince humans to stop moving. It filled royal granaries. It paid workers. It fed armies. It kept giant cities alive. It moved across oceans with colonists. It helped trigger riots when harvests failed. And in the 20th century, new forms of wheat became one of the main weapons humanity used against mass famine. Today, wheat still provides roughly 1/5 of the food, energy, and protein consumed by humans worldwide. More than 2.5 billion people eat it, and for many of them, it is a primary staple. So the history of wheat is not really the history of one crop. It is the history of what happens when a grass becomes infrastructure, and that story begins before farming even existed. More than 14,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in what is now Jordan were already gathering wild cereals and turning them into something recognizably bread-like. Archaeologists at a site called Shubaker 1 found charred crumbs from flatbread made thousands of years before agriculture became established. That discovery changed an old assumption. Humans did not necessarily invent farming first and bread second. In at least some places, people wanted the food before they built the system that could produce it reliably. Imagine the amount of work involved. Wild grains were small. They had to be collected by hand, cleaned, pounded, ground, mixed with water, and cooked. This was not convenience food. If people were willing to spend that much effort on wild cereal, the reward must have mattered. Then, around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, the relationship between humans and wheat changed permanently. Wild einkorn and emmer wheat grew across parts of the Near East. In the wild, these plants had a useful survival trick. When the seed had matured, it shattered. The grains fell away and scattered themselves across the ground. That is excellent for a wild plant. It is terrible for a farmer trying to harvest it. Generation after generation, people gathered the plants whose seed heads stayed together a little longer. Whether they understood the genetics did not matter. Their choices did the work. Over time, non-shattering wheat became more common in cultivated fields. The plant was becoming easier for humans to harvest, but worse at surviving without them. This was one of the quiet bargains behind agriculture. Wheat became dependent on human hands. Humans became dependent on wheat harvests. Once a community can grow and store large amounts of grain, something dramatic becomes possible. Food can wait. Meat spoils. Fruit rots. Herds can wander off. But dry grain, stored properly, can sit for months or longer. That means a successful harvest can feed people after the growing season is over. It can support specialists who do not farm. Builders, soldiers, priests, administrators, craftsmen, rulers. It also creates something worth controlling. Across the Near East, farming spread, populations grew, and permanent settlements became more common. Wheat did not single-handedly create civilization. Humans domesticated many plants and animals, and the transition to agriculture was complicated, slow, and different from place to place. But wheat was one of the crops at the center of that transformation. A field of grain could be counted, a harvest could be measured. a surplus could be taxed. And once rulers learned that, wheat stopped being only food. It became power. The wheat people were domesticating was not exactly the wheat most people know today. Wheat is really a family of related grasses with a surprisingly tangled genetic history. Early farmers worked with species such as einkorn and emmer. Much later, through natural hybridization and continued human selection, other forms appeared. Modern bread wheat carries 6 sets of chromosomes, the genetic result of different grass lineages combining over time. Durum wheat, the kind used for many pastas and couscous, followed a different branch of that family. That complicated ancestry turned out to be an advantage. Different wheats could thrive in different places, tolerate different seasons, and produce flour with different properties. Bread wheat contains proteins that can form the elastic gluten network that traps gas in dough, making risen loaves possible. Durum produces the hard, glassy grain that works so well for pasta. Ancient farmers did not know any of this chemistry or genetics. They simply kept the seeds that gave them useful harvests and useful food. Over thousands of seasons, that practical selection turned wheat into something increasingly customized for human civilization. The plant became less effective at scattering its own seeds and more effective at feeding the people who planted it. That is the paradox at the center of domestication. Humans made wheat extraordinarily successful as a species by making it terrible at living without humans. Nowhere was that clearer than in ancient Egypt. Every year, the Nile flooded its banks and left behind fertile soil. Egyptian farmers used that landscape to grow cereals, especially emmer wheat and barley. Bread and beer became foundations of daily life. Tomb models from ancient Egypt show workers grinding grain, kneading dough, baking bread, and brewing beer almost like a miniature factory frozen in time. But grain was not just what Egyptians ate. It was one of the ways the state functioned. For much of Egyptian history, taxes were not paid with coins. Officials assessed fields and harvests, and grain was collected, stored, redistributed, and used to support the machinery of government. Some went to feed workers. Some supported temples and royal projects. Some could be traded for goods Egypt did not produce. Some was stored as protection against poor harvests. Think about what that means. A granary was more than a warehouse. It was a battery for political power. Fill it, and the state could pay people without modern money. Empty it, and the state had a problem. A ruler who controlled grain controlled time. He could take part of one season's harvest and spend it months later. He could move food from a productive region to a hungry one. He could support thousands of people working on projects that produced no food at all. Agriculture created surplus, but administration turned surplus into a state. The system also changed what a harvest meant socially. A farmer might see sacks of grain as food for a household. An official could see the same sacks as tax revenue, wages, military provisions, temple support, trade goods, and insurance against famine. Grain was divisible, measurable, and relatively durable. Those qualities made it ideal for early bureaucracies. Long before anyone had a modern central bank, states were already managing reserves of stored calories. That is one reason cereal agriculture and administration became so tightly connected. To control grain, a government needed people who could measure fields, estimate yields, keep records, guard storage, organize transport, and decide who received what. The boring paperwork of civilization grew alongside the harvest. A surplus created opportunity, but it also created accountants. And it created inequality. Whoever controlled the storehouse did not merely control food. They controlled access to food between harvests. A bad flood, a drought, or a failed crop could turn that control into enormous political leverage. The same granary that protected a population in a crisis could also make that population dependent on the institution holding the keys. And as empires became larger, that relationship between wheat and political survival became even more dangerous. By the time Rome became the dominant power of the Mediterranean, the city of Rome had grown far beyond what nearby farms could reliably support. Hundreds of thousands of people lived inside one enormous urban machine. They needed grain every day, whether the weather was good, whether pirates were active, whether a war was happening, whether a harvest had failed somewhere across the sea. Rome's answer was logistics on an imperial scale. Grain arrived from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. After Rome took Egypt in 30 BCE, the Nile Valley became one of the empire's crucial grain sources. Ships carried enormous quantities across the Mediterranean. State officials supervised the supply. A public grain distribution system helped provide grain to eligible citizens. Under Augustus, the administration of the annona became a major responsibility because a hungry capital was a politically dangerous capital. The empire had built something remarkable, a city partially fed by harvests grown hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. But that also created a weakness. Rome was powerful because it could command distant bread baskets. Rome was vulnerable because it needed them. When North Africa became increasingly important to the Western Empire's grain supply, control of those provinces mattered far beyond their borders. In the 5th century, the Vandal conquest of North Africa threatened one of the food systems that had helped sustain Rome. The story is a reminder that an empire can control armies, roads, laws, and currencies. But if the grain ships stop arriving, all of that power suddenly becomes very fragile. Wheat was moving in other directions too. As farming populations expanded out of the Near East, wheat traveled with them into Europe. It also moved eastward across Asia. Archaeological evidence places wheat in parts of China by the 3rd millennium BCE, long before it became the giant modern crop China grows today. In every region, people adapted wheat to local climates and adapted wheat foods to local culture. The same family of plants became flatbreads in one place, noodles in another, leavened loaves somewhere else, pasta and couscous elsewhere. That flexibility matters. Wheat is not one food. It is a raw material that can become hundreds of foods. The eastward journey produced another important transformation. Wheat entered food cultures that already had their own major grains. In northern China, for example, wheat did not simply replace millet. People learned to process it in ways that fit local tastes and techniques. Ground flour became noodles, steamed breads, dumplings, and other foods that today feel completely native to East Asian cuisines. A crop born thousands of kilometers away was absorbed so thoroughly that its foreign origin became almost invisible. That may be wheat's most powerful cultural trick. It rarely arrives as wheat. It arrives as a food people make their own. The grain disappears into the recipe. In the Mediterranean, it can become bread or pasta. In North Africa, couscous. In South Asia, flatbreads. In East Asia, noodles and steamed doughs. The crop spreads globally while the foods remain intensely local. And that made it unusually good at surviving cultural change. Empires disappeared, religions changed, languages vanished, but the grain kept moving. By medieval and early modern Europe, bread had become so central that the quality of bread could reveal a person's place in society. Wealthier households could afford finer white flour. Poorer people often ate darker, coarser bread or mixtures of different grains. The distinction was not just taste. Producing very white flour meant discarding more of the grain and using more labor. White bread was a visible form of waste that only made sense if you had enough food to waste some of it. For governments, bread prices became an obsession because crowds understood the food system in immediate terms. If grain disappeared from the market, people suspected hoarding. If prices rose too quickly, they blamed merchants, officials, or the crown. When hunger met distrust, grain markets could become political battlefields. France learned that repeatedly. In 1775, shortages and high prices helped ignite the Flour War, a wave of hundreds of riots and grain seizures. Then the situation deteriorated again in the late 1780s. Population had grown. Harvests were poor. Bread prices rose. For many wage-earning families, bread could take 60 to 80% of household spending. That meant a price increase that looked small on paper could destroy a family budget. By 1789, the crisis of bread was colliding with a crisis of legitimacy. When the Bastille was stormed in July, the crowd was seeking arms, but grain mattered too. In October, market women marched from Paris to Versailles demanding bread and forced the royal family back to Paris. The French Revolution had many causes: debt, inequality, political paralysis, Enlightenment ideas, resentment of privilege. But none of those causes happened in a vacuum. They happened in bodies that still needed to eat every day. That is why wheat has such a strange relationship with politics. When it is abundant, almost nobody notices it. When it becomes scarce, everyone suddenly understands how important it is. Then wheat crossed an ocean and began another transformation. Wheat was an old world crop. After European contact connected the Americas more permanently to Europe, Africa, and Asia, wheat traveled west as part of the enormous biological exchange that reshaped the planet. Colonists planted it because bread was familiar, culturally important, and useful. In regions with suitable climates, wheat spread across new landscapes. The crop also traveled with empire. European settlement did not simply move people. It moved entire agricultural systems, animals, weeds, microbes, tools, and crops. A wheat field in the Americas was not only food production. It was a piece of the old world transplanted into a new ecology. Over the following centuries, especially in North America, wheat cultivation expanded across enormous areas. But the real explosion came when machines started replacing some of the hardest parts of grain farming. For most of wheat's history, harvest time created a brutal labor problem. Grain had to be cut at the right moment. Wait too long and weather, birds, or shattering could destroy part of the crop. A farm could grow only as much wheat as people and animals could harvest quickly enough. Mechanical reapers changed that equation. In the 19th century, machines such as the McCormick reaper allowed farmers to cut grain much faster than crews working with hand tools. Threshing machines separated grain from stalks. Steam and later gasoline power reduced more labor. Railroads moved wheat from inland farms to distant cities and ports. Grain elevators stored enormous quantities and turned individual harvests into a standardized commodity that could be bought, sold, graded, and shipped at industrial scale. A farmer no longer needed to feed the nearest town. A farmer could feed a market on another continent. This was the beginning of the modern wheat system, giant producing regions connected to giant consuming cities through machines. Finance, railways, ports, and eventually global futures markets. The field had become part of a network. Industrialization also changed the idea of quality. Before large grain networks, wheat was mostly a local product. Farmers knew their varieties. Millers knew nearby farms. Buyers judged what was physically in front of them. But national and international trade required categories. Grain had to become interchangeable enough that a buyer could purchase wheat from far away without seeing every kernel first. Grades, standardized weights, inspection systems, and commodity exchanges helped make that possible. Once wheat could be standardized, it could also become financial. Merchants could contract for future deliveries. Millers could plan purchases months ahead. Farmers could sell into markets shaped by harvests on the other side of the world. A drought in one region could raise prices somewhere else before a ship had moved a single sack. The crop had entered a new phase. For most of history, wheat connected a farmer to a nearby community. In the industrial age, it connected weather in one continent to bread prices in another. And then the 20th century pushed that network to its limits. After the Second World War, many scientists and governments were terrified by a simple question: could food production keep up with population growth? In Mexico, an agricultural research program supported by the Mexican government and the Rockefeller Foundation worked on improving wheat. One of the scientists at the center of that effort was Norman Borlaug, a plant pathologist and breeder who spent years fighting wheat diseases and developing higher-yielding varieties. The problem with simply feeding wheat more fertilizer was that traditional tall plants often grew too high and collapsed under the weight of heavier grain heads. Breeders developed shorter, sturdier plants that could use fertilizer more effectively without falling over. Borlaug and his colleagues also bred for disease resistance and used an unusual strategy of growing generations in different parts of Mexico to accelerate breeding. The result was a group of high-yielding wheat varieties that helped transform production first in Mexico and then in countries including India and Pakistan during the 1960s. The timing was critical. South Asia was facing recurring food shortages and deep fears of famine. New wheat varieties combined with irrigation, fertilizer, Pesticides, credit, government support, and expanded agricultural infrastructure produced dramatic increases in harvests. India's wheat production rose rapidly in the years that followed. The wider transformation became known as the Green Revolution. It was not magic, and it was not free. Intensive farming increased dependence on irrigation, fertilizer, and other inputs. Benefits were uneven. Environmental costs accumulated. Small farmers did not always benefit in the same way as larger ones. But the basic achievement was enormous. Much more grain could be produced from the same land, and hundreds of millions of people lived through a period when many experts had expected chronic mass hunger to become much worse. In 1970, Norman Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on food production. A scientist who bred wheat had won a Peace Prize because by then the connection was obvious. Food security was not separate from political stability. It was one of its foundations. The Green Revolution also changed the relationship between science and agriculture. For most of wheat's history, improvement happened slowly as farmers saved seed from plants that performed well. In the 20th century, breeding became a coordinated international project. Researchers exchanged germplasm across borders, tested varieties in different climates, deliberately combined disease resistance with yield traits, and treated the wheat genome as a global library of useful possibilities. That system is one reason a disease outbreak in one region can trigger research work somewhere else almost immediately today. The crop is global, and increasingly, so is the effort to protect it. And that is still true. The scale of the modern wheat system is hard to picture. Global harvests now approach 800 million tons in a year. Wheat is grown across temperate zones, highlands, irrigated plains, and dry farming regions on nearly every inhabited continent. Some countries grow mostly for themselves. Others produce huge export surpluses. Many large cities depend on imports because the climate around them cannot produce enough wheat for the people who live there. That creates a map of invisible dependence. A bakery in Cairo can be affected by weather in Russia. A noodle producer in Southeast Asia can care about harvests in Australia or Canada. A government in North Africa can watch wheat futures in Chicago because a jump in global prices may become a political problem at home. Flour feels local when it is stacked in a supermarket, but the price printed on the bag can contain information from half the planet. And unlike a luxury commodity, wheat is difficult to simply stop buying. When coffee gets expensive, people can drink less coffee. When a stable grain gets expensive, low-income families may have nowhere else to cut. That is why governments subsidize bread, hold grain reserves, regulate imports, or intervene in wheat markets. The crop is traded like a commodity, but politically it behaves more like a public utility. In February 2020, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, wheat prices jumped sharply. The reason was geography. Russia and Ukraine were both major wheat exporters, and the Black Sea was one of the world's crucial grain corridors. Together, before the war, the two countries accounted for roughly a quarter of global wheat exports. Several countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and other regions depended heavily on supplies from them. Suddenly, ports were blocked or threatened. Insurance costs surged. Fields became battlefields. Storage facilities and infrastructure were damaged. Governments far from Ukraine began worrying about bread prices at home. The worst predictions of a permanent collapse in global wheat shipments did not happen. Other exporters adjusted, trade routes shifted, and later agreements helped some Ukrainian grain move through the Black Sea. But the price shock revealed something ancient inside a modern system. We still live at the mercy of grain routes. Rome waited for ships from Egypt and North Africa. Modern cities wait for bulk carriers, rail networks, fertilizer deliveries, fuel, ports, and international markets. The technology is different. The dependency is not, and wheat now faces another problem that no empire can negotiate with: climate. Wheat prefers relatively cool growing conditions, which makes extreme heat dangerous. Drought can cut yields. Floods can destroy fields. Fungal diseases such as rusts and wheat blast can move into new regions as conditions change. Scientists are now searching modern breeding collections and ancient wild relatives for genes that can help wheat survive hotter temperatures, less predictable rain, and evolving diseases. That is almost poetic, because the future of modern wheat may depend on genetic diversity preserved in the old forms humans once domesticated and replaced. 10,000 years ago, people changed wild grasses by selecting the plants that worked best for human life. Today, scientists are going back through that enormous family tree, trying to find traits that can keep wheat alive in a climate humans are changing again. And the stakes are difficult to exaggerate. Wheat remains one of humanity's largest sources of calories and plant protein. It feeds billions of people in forms so ordinary that we rarely connect them back to a field. A loaf of bread, a bowl of noodles, a plate of pasta, a tortilla made from wheat flour, a biscuit, a dumpling. Each one looks like food. Behind it is a global machine of seeds, soil, rain, fertilizer, machinery, finance, shipping, politics, and science. That machine is one of the quiet reasons modern civilization can exist at its current scale, which brings us back to Paris in 1789. The people in those streets did not need an economics degree to understand the food system. They understood it every time they went to buy bread. When grain was cheap and available, the system felt invisible. When it failed, the state itself suddenly looked fragile. The same pattern had already appeared in ancient granaries and Roman grain fleets. It appeared again in colonial farms, industrial wheat belts, Green Revolution research stations, and Black Sea shipping lanes. Different century, different empire, same basic rule. Civilization becomes complicated very quickly, but hunger remains simple. That may be the real history of wheat. Humans domesticated a grass because its seeds were useful. Then we built villages around it. States learned to tax it. Empires learned to move it. Markets learned to price it. Scientists learned to redesign it. And billions of people learned to depend on it so completely that most of us barely notice it anymore, until the harvest fails. So the next time you tear a piece from a loaf of bread, look at it for what it really is, not just flour, water, yeast, and heat. It is the descendant of wild grasses gathered by hunter-gatherers before farming existed. It is a piece of the Fertile Crescent, an Egyptian tax payment, a Roman supply line, a French political crisis, a machine-age commodity, a Green Revolution experiment, and a modern geopolitical pressure point. A grain small enough to disappear in your hand helped feed cities too large to survive without it. It fed empires. And in many ways, it still feeds ours.